Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Ellen Fanning. Coming up, appeals for the government to evacuate COVID-positive Australians from India as another resident dies from the virus thousands of kilometres from home. The Fair Work Commission finds that a delivery driver dumped by Deliveroo was in fact an employee and was entitled to greater protections. And work to death. New research suggests hundreds of thousands of people are working themselves into an early grave every year. Joining me on the panel tonight, Industry Professor at Jumbunna Institute of Education and Research at UTS and Labor Party member Nareen Young, always lovely to see you.
You too, Ellen.
Author and barrister Geoffrey Robertson, good to have you in.
Hi.
Board member of organisations such as Catholic Healthcare and the Chris O'Brien Lifehouse, Rebecca Davies. Hello, Rebecca. Sorry we couldn't fit you in the studio. And in Melbourne, former Liberal advisor and current party member Brigid Meney. Hi, Bridge.
Hi.
And you can join us on Twitter using the hashtag #TheDrum, and we're on Facebook. The government has a moral and ethical obligation to bring Australians home from India, regardless of their COVID status. That's the assessment of a group of public health experts who say that the health system in India is on the brink of collapse.
We need to shift our thinking from returnees to medical evacuation. These are people who, if they do need medical care, would do better, much better, in Australia than they would in India.
Just hours after these experts spoke out, we learned that a Sydney father of two became the latest Australian to die in India. 47-year-old Govind Kant travelled there for personal reasons late last month. He died of COVID in hospital. The travel ban imposed at the start of May ended over the weekend, but 42 Australians were barred from the first repatriation flight. The Drum's Stephanie Bolchi has spoken to two families in India impacted by the flight ban.
Melbourne IT professional Prashant Pandey was supposed to be on the first Qantas repatriation flight after the 2-week ban. But nearly half the flight was unable to board. Some tested positive, others were close contacts.
Even though I don't have any symptoms, nothing, but I still tested positive, so we have to check out.
Prashant says they were left to fend for themselves.
I was quite surprised because the people who were tested positive in the close contact, they were just roaming around the hotel. I was completely shocked. Most of the people, they were not from Delhi. They were from different states. So they have to get into the vehicle, or they have to go into a flight or train or whatever, and they have to get back their home because there was no facility for them.
Prashant is one of at least 12 who've been confirmed to have had negative tests since. It's been revealed that the testing company, CRL Diagnostics, had its accreditation suspended last month. But Qantas has retested the samples, and it says the positive results were accurate. It says those residents wanting to return to Australia must wait 14 days before they're eligible again.
I don't want me to be on that flight in Australia and I transmit that disease in Australia. I don't want that. So I'm going to stay here for a while, like 5-6 days, and get tested again.
Prashant has been helping others to fly to and from India during the crisis. And late last year, he travelled to India to be with his wife and newborn baby, but says it's time for him to return to Australia.
Me and my wife, we decided that, you know what, you stay here for a while, let me go back. And once everything is settled down, I'm going to call you guys back. You can't take risk with the baby.
More than 4,000 people a day are dying in India.
And since my father is alone here, we cannot, leave them here.
Ketan's mother died from a heart attack after catching COVID.
There is risk of life for the city.
Everyone in this video has had the virus, but thankfully they've recovered. Ketan doesn't want to leave his dad alone, but their application to bring him to Australia as an immediate family member has been rejected. And they don't understand why.
He's the only son who can look after him.
Others are calling on the Australian government to provide the necessary vaccines for the 9,000 vulnerable Australian residents in India.
People have lost their humanity. They don't care about anybody else. I can see in India, bodies are floating on the river. It's heartbreaking. Trust me, that is heartbreaking.
Brigid Meney, let's start with you tonight. Let's think about this man, 47-year-old Govind Kant. He'd been working here in Australia We know that for the last 8 years. Perhaps he'd been in Australia for longer, so he'd contributed to our society, he'd paid his taxes. We've seen some photographs released of him in his professional capacity in Australia. He obviously got permission from the government to leave, and so that's a hard question here. Should he have been entitled to believe that Australia would come to his rescue?
Look, I certainly think so, and I think that it's a sad case for many where we've, for Australia, where we've created almost two tiers of citizenship, where we're, denying people's legal right to return to their country, their home. And, I think that although that puts me at odds with, polling, which suggests that, over 70% of Australians, are happy to keep borders closed, even if it is against Australian citizens. I think that's a really sad fact for us to confront here. But I do think, the government's decision really speaks to that tension we often see between elected representatives and their responsibility to be representative of the, majority view of their constituents, but then, also be leaders for their constituents. And sometimes they aren't always the same thing. And, making that decision on which way you go is an important one reserved for critical situations. But I do think that, returning Australian citizens who are vulnerable to Australia, or at least providing, we talk a lot about providing vaccinations to the vulnerable, and that was a big topic of discussion today. Well, these Australian citizens are vulnerable, and I know it's a matter of logistics, and I know that there's tricky things, to consider here, but, this is a country, we've invented a whole lot of things and, pioneered so many new endeavours. I'm sure we can find a way.
Yet again, we saw in that video, Nareen, this confusion about what the rules are and what the rules ought to be, and, the talk of, well, some people tested positive, but they were roaming around in close quarters with people who tested negative who did get on the flight. And who's deciding all of this?
Well, I'm concerned that it seems to be Qantas making the rules rather than the government, but it seems to be characteristic of what's epitomised this government's approach to how the pandemic's been handled. 1 minute there's one thing happening, next minute there's another thing happening. I think what this speaks to is a lack of application of rules, of any a lack of complying with what the ordinary obligations would be for citizens, and a lack of them being applied.
Yeah. Geoffrey, you're in the country for a speaking tour. So explain how is it that you got? Was it hard to get here? Obviously, it's an impossibility to get out of India with a travel ban.
It's ridiculous because the plane was empty.
Coming from London.
Yes. So it's important that individuals, if you're a tennis player, for example, if you're a politician, you seem to fly around without any consequence. But the thing that we can't get used to, and I speak as an expatriate, not an expatriate, as some people seem to think, is that this country did not do its duty. Its duty primarily is to protect its citizens. And when Dr. Fauci last year said there is only one way forward to beat the pandemic, it's vaccinate, 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 suddenly we didn't buy the right vaccines, ready vaccines. So vaccines came on miraculously, devised by, let it be said loudly, the children of refugees, of Turkish refugees taken on by generous Germany. Did we buy them? No. And Mr. Morrison said, we'll sit in the front row and watch everyone else be vaccinated. I was vaccinated 5 months ago.
Really? What with?
Yes.
What with, by the way? Pfizer or Astra?
I was Pfizered.
Right, you were Pfizered.
It was a wonderful experience. You've got to sit for 15 minutes to make sure that you don't you don't disappear. And you suddenly feel this freedom from fear. And that freedom from fear is what this government should have guaranteed to everyone. Now I gather we're getting some Pfizer at the end of the year, maybe next year. Moderna will come sometime. We don't know when. And I think it's a real dereliction of duty. We need a royal commission to
Oh gosh,
understand.
another one? Another one?
I don't think it should be a royal commission, perhaps an Australian commission to find out what went wrong, because something did. And we find ourselves, there are 37 countries that are reckoned to be advanced and
In their vaccine rollout.
And we're we're number 34.
Right. Let me turn to Rebecca. I mean, as Brigid pointed out, we had that opinion poll, for what it's worth, yesterday. 73% of Australians happy with closed borders until 2022. Almost 80% in a Nine poll today say even if we're all vaccinated, to Geoffrey's point, we still shouldn't necessarily open up borders straight away. I mean, Rebecca, can I say, here's the reality. Once the vulnerable are vaccinated and everybody else has had an opportunity to be vaccinated, can I say whenever we open the borders, 2022, 2032, COVID will again spread in the community. Do Australians accept that reality?
They clearly don't at the moment, and obviously the opinion poll is based on conversations that have been happening, which have focused a lot about risk, and people have said, well, given that there's such a low amount of COVID in Australia, I'm not going to take any risks as far as vaccines go. But that's such a short-sighted view to take, because we all know, I mean, Geoffrey said it, the feeling of relief and freedom once you've been vaccinated, that is going to enable foreign students to come back, for our universities to thrive, for us to be able to travel, etc. So we have to change the conversation to being a different one about risk, because absolutely things are going to happen. We know that. It happened just in Sydney in the last few weeks, where 2 people got COVID and we don't know how they got it. So those things are going to happen. But we accept that. And our system, because we haven't been flooded by large numbers, our system is well prepared for the small number of events that might happen once we open the borders. So we are in, and it goes back to the India conversation, our system can look after our people, and that's what it's about. It should be.
But Nareen, you haven't been on that bandwagon of people saying, let's get these borders open, have you?
No, not at all, because I'm, to Geoffrey's point and to the point about the vaccination stroll out, as a wit on Twitter referred to it yesterday, we'd be in a far different position if we'd been vaccinated well, properly and early. And we wouldn't be having these discussions. If we had some quarantine facilities, we wouldn't be having these discussions. Wouldn't
we? Because, I mean, there was some data out, I think, last month that talked about the flu virus, right? The ABC figured it out, put it online. Hundreds of Australian flu deaths have been avoided because of COVID.
That's because we're not seeing each other.
Yeah, well, and because of the borders are closed. You know, every year we get the northern flu virus from the northern hemisphere and people die. And we saw some straight talking from the Virgin CEO yesterday saying, you know,
straight talking?
What did you think of that?
I thought people will die was a terrible thing to say, and that really worries me if that's the view of the airlines.
No, it's a false dichotomy. We're not talking about bringing people in who've got late-stage COVID. If they are Australians, we should.
But you can die from early-stage COVID. You can die from any COVID if you can't get the
whole art is to open the borders with the least risk. Open them to people who've been vaccinated, for a start.
Who can still spread the virus.
Have a quarantine facility.
Have a quarantine facility. They can do home quarantine. They could do, most countries have 7 days quarantine. We have 14. We can open the borders so that there are no deaths. And to suggest, the Prime Minister called it insensitive, I would call it stupid, to say that it's balancing all these deaths against profit for Richard Branson. That's absurd. But we can open the borders carefully without incurring deaths.
Brigid, I think living with COVID then is a different conversation to the one we were expecting. We were expecting last year, weren't we, a miracle vaccine, which we got, and then we go back to normal. But you know, where this conversation, all these conversations end up is tracing. You know, all the Victorians have to give their last names when they go in with their QR codes, and this just goes on. We just have to live with this. It doesn't become endemic very quickly at all. It remains a pandemic.
I think that's what, you know, coming back to that risk analysis, you know, I think we haven't kind of set expectations really well with, you know, people living in Australia, in that every time we've had a case, you know, whether that be, you know, anywhere out of New South Wales, essentially, you know, they've done short, sharp lockdowns. And
I remember saying to a friend overseas, like, we've shut 2 Australian states, and she said, how many cases have you got? And I said, 2.
So people are fearful of you know, losing their rights to, you know, go out to dinner and see their family. But we really do have to set expectations that, you know, I think, you know, going forward, deaths should very much be preventable with not just vaccinations, but with quarantine and, you know, adequate health facilities to deal with any COVID cases that occur, and making sure there's room in our hospitals and staff set aside and things like that. But, you know, we do have to prepare people for the fact that there will be cases. And, you know, life can continue on.
And Geoffrey, just a final point. I mean, you've campaigned for months now that this capping of the number of Australians who can return home each day, each week, each month is a violation of international law. What are your thoughts about making that argument successfully, given that the federal court last week upheld the Indian travel ban?
It didn't decide the constitutional question. It put that aside. It said that the travel ban was according to the law that had been passed in 2015.
The Biosecurity Act was intended to impinge on common law rights, Justice Thorley said, just to annoy you.
Yes, of course. It doesn't. On the contrary, the common law right goes back to Magna Carta.
Yes, that one.
It actually says anyone may leave and return to the kingdom without fear by land or water. They hadn't invented aeroplanes in 1215, but you get the idea. And it's in all the international conventions. I think if the High Court were ever asked, it would decide that it was an implicit right in Australian citizenship and the Constitution to be able to return. And that is what the government is denying. Most of my clients have been Pfizered or AstraZeneca. They're in no danger, and they are all prepared to pay for quarantine, and they desperately need to get home because their parents are dying, or their relatives are really sick, or they need that job which is only available for the next 6 months. So it's causing incredible heartache to thousands upon thousands of Australians, fellow Australians. And we can get them in, but we're not.
Well, the impact of closed borders has meant families who've lost loved ones overseas have been unable to come together to mourn their deaths. The Drum has spoken to Australians with Indian heritage who have lost multiple family members. The Katyal family, who live southwest of Sydney, are grieving. They spent hours on the phone trying to get their father a COVID test so he could be admitted to a hospital. Eventually he was admitted, but too late.
We approached some of our friends to get the bed as soon as possible. Because of too many cases in the hospital, we agreed there was no bed, but at least he started some procedure to get him oxygen so that he can survive at that time. But unfortunately, at that time, our bad luck, you know, he admitted to the hospital, and within 5 to 10 minutes, he passed away because luckily he got oxygen, but there was no mask in the hospital. I lost my dad within 5 to 10 minutes. I really miss him very bad. Today is almost 1 month. We miss him a lot.
My father-in-law, he was the pillar of the family. He was a very jovial person. He loved traveling, and we never thought that this pandemic would affect our families so bad.
He was very excited to see my daughter. On 16th, we come from hospital, and he done a very good FaceTime with him, and I have no clue how we lost him next early morning straight away, and I think he was just waiting to see my daughter only just a day before, and then he just passed away, you know.
But मैं तो यही बोलती हूँ कि जहाँ पे भी है वो भगवान उनको शांति दे.
I really wanted to go because in our Hindu culture, the son only do all these things, you know. But unfortunately, because of the COVID restriction and stuff, I can't travel.
Son is the only one who does all the last rites for the father or parents. So I know at this point in time how he has been feeling very miserable, helpless.
With this COVID, you know, everybody is suffering, so my mother's still alone there, so I really wanted to bring my mother here, but still with this pandemic, COVID restriction, we can't still bring my mother here as well. My sister, she's in California, I'm here, my mother is alone. I don't know how this is gonna happen.
This is where we all are suffering. So if special flights can be arranged for such families with the guarantee that within few weeks, if the families can travel back, that would be a major, major help from the government. If this would have happened earlier, my husband would have traveled and saw his dad and mum, and we could have brought our mum here straight away rather than just leaving her. We have lost our dad. We don't want other families to suffer and go through this.
So many Australian families affected, aren't there? You're watching The Drum. With me on the panel are Industry Professor at Jumbunna Institute of Education and Research at UTS, Nareen Young, author and barrister Geoffrey Robertson, Company Director Rebecca Davies, and in Melbourne tonight, former Liberal advisor Brigid Meney. Sergei Magnitsky was a father, a husband and a lawyer. He was a Russian hired to unpick the complicated tax arrangements of a Western company working in Moscow. In 2007, he uncovered a plot by some Russian officials to funnel hundreds of millions of dollars in tax refunds to an organised crime group. When he attempted to blow the whistle, he was thrown in jail, setting off a chain of events that would alter international diplomacy forever.
At the turn of the century, Sergei Magnitsky was working with the big international hedge funds flocking into Russia to scoop up former state-owned assets. It was during his work for American businessman Bill Browder that the taxation lawyer stumbled upon a massive fraud being committed by Russian officials.
Sergei Magnitsky was hired to investigate what they were up to. He discovered that in addition to stealing our investment holding companies, the perpetrators used the stolen companies to steal $230 million of taxes that we paid to the Russian government.
Magnitsky alleged the perpetrators were police, organised crime figures and members of the government. He reported the crime to prosecutors and publicly named the corrupt officials. Instead of action being taken against these groups, it was Magnitsky who was arrested and jailed. He died an excruciating death without medical treatment at the age of 37. The officials involved were exonerated. Stricken by his lawyer's death, Bill Browder began lobbying outside Russia to seek justice.
Sergei Magnitsky was murdered, defying the tyranny of Vladimir Putin's Russia.
Senator McCain sponsored the Magnitsky Act, which was signed into law in 2012, which froze assets and issued travel bans against Russian human rights violators. Similar laws were adopted in the UK and Canada. Browder and his team have tracked about 3.5 of the $230 million original tax fraud to Australian bank accounts. Late last year, a bipartisan parliamentary committee recommended Australia adopt a version of the laws. But there are concerns amongst some diplomats that Australia's rocky relationship with China could worsen if the laws are enacted. The chief executive of Hong Kong, Carrie Lam, revealed in 2020 that she'd been Magnitsky'd.
I have piles of cash at home because the government is paying me cash for my salary because I don't have a bank account.
The Morrison government is considering the report from its parliamentary committee.
That was The Drum's Eliza Harvey. Rebecca, put your Transparency International hat on for me. I know we're a very important country right in the middle of the universe, right? And you know, we're all right in the middle of that ourselves. But why would Russian oligarchs and Saudi princes be quaking in their shoes about Australia passing a Magnitsky Act?
Well, because Australia has been actually behind the 8 ball in dealing with corruption, and we see this on many levels, of course. And so, in a sense, I'm not saying we're leading the world in this regard, but Australia is seen as a bit of a safe haven for the proceeds of crime. So we don't have anti-money laundering laws which require people like real estate agents to report suspicious transactions. So if you've got a few million to spare, you can funnel it through real estate in Sydney, for example. So we don't have a federal anti-corruption commission, as we know. We've talked about that many times. So our regime is relatively lax. So having something like this legislation would show that we were serious. It needs to be part of a suite of measures, but focusing on individuals who are funneling ill-gotten gains into our country would be a very good thing. And we also know, of course, that where corruption flourishes, human rights violations flourish as well. So it would also send a signal in that regard that we were being serious about these sorts of issues.
Now, Geoffrey, you've sent Australia draft legislation that we could enact if we wanted to, and there's been a parliamentary inquiry into this and some consideration of it. But it's not a prosecution of the bad guys. It's not a sanction on their countries. And Carrie Lam is never going to worry. She's there in Hong Kong and she's got a bedroom.
Her house is being cluttered up by
with cash.
$5 million Hong Kong dollars.
Well, there we are. And every time the cleaner comes, she doesn't have to worry she's got the change. And if anyone wants
a good laugh on social
so
media.
what's that achieving?
But more seriously, you sanction the individuals who devised the concentration camps for the Uyghurs, and more importantly, you sanction the parastatal that sells the slave labour cotton.
How do you
and when that was done, well, America sanctioned them and Britain a few months ago. What happened then? It's a system of naming, blaming and shaming, because immediately the brands that did business, i.e. Nike and Adidas and all the fashion brands, stopped buying their cotton. I think the only exception was Hugo Boss. But since he made Nazi uniforms for the concentration camps, it was in the firm's tradition. But that was something that China took very seriously. It was very upset about. And that is the advantage of sanctions. We are saying, and so are all the Western clothing manufacturers, this insults our values. This is not our democratic value. We're not going to buy slave labour cotton. And so, yes, it doesn't put any Chinese in prison, it doesn't declare war on China, but there is no alternative. We had an international criminal court, started at Nuremberg in 1946, then in the Balkans in the 1990s, but now the International Criminal Court in the last 18 years has put in jail only a few Congo warlords. And so we cannot, because the Security Council is poleaxed. The Russians, the Chinese, even the Americans will veto anything to do with investigating Israel. Any country with a friend in the big three will never be punished. And
so let me just ask you, because
the sanctions are the next best.
All right, but so one imagines a Russian oligarch, right? And there's money pouring into his or her pockets, and that's terrific. They need a bank account because they might want to go to Harrods and spend a lot of money, and they might want to buy a house in Mayfair, and they might want to send their kids to Eton. But there are restrictions out of China about who can leave and how much money they can take. So how effective is the threat of Magnitsky if you are a prison guard in a labour camp, a forced labour camp in Xinjiang, or you're a functionary?
As a prison guard, you may just hold your hand in terms of beating up a prisoner, because you may want your child to go and study in the West, and that will not be available to them. There is a point, we've seen it happen, what I call the train drivers to Auschwitz, the lickspittle judges and the doctors who turn a blind eye to torture.
These are the ones you target.
People do want to travel. They want to take their families to Europe. They want to put their kids at universities and their parents in hospitals. So they are influenced and they are deterred by the threat of Magnitsky sanctions. And Australia is a pretty good capital market in Asia. It's got a much admired system of hospitals, universities, and the like. So I think it would be appropriate. And there are now 31 countries, all of them open societies, the countries of Europe, Canada, America,
who've passed these
who
laws.
have passed these laws. So we should be part of this network of open societies. We've got to fight back for liberal democracy. Most people in the world live under authoritarian regimes. There are 92 autocracies. So this is part of an assertion of our values.
But Nareen, our values, I mean, is there a sense that these provisions exist to punish the bad people in the bad countries? Because since 1990, the UNHCR has upheld 17 complaints against Australia that were said to have breached the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and a lot of them related to offshore detention. So should we be happy as a country to say, well, let the immigration minister in Australia and the one before him and the one before him and the one before him don't have a bank account and can't travel?
Well, there's the continuing exemption from the Race Discrimination Act for the intervention to be applied still in the Northern Territory. There's however many, the horrific number of Aboriginal people who have died in custody over the last 30 years. There's all kinds of human rights abuses that occur in Australia. So while I support what's being said, I would think that Australia has a lot of work to do, both in terms of detention and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's human rights, to examine itself. So don't be going and saying that other people are being the bad guys, as you term them, if it's the case that you behave pretty badly yourself.
And if we were to do this, would we have to accept that individuals could be targeted, either justly in the view of some or as bad faith actors? You know, we saw that the Chinese from Beijing was saying, here's a doctored picture of your soldiers in Afghanistan committing war crimes. Remember that? And that you know, there you are, you've got a bad faith actor doing that, or indeed coming out and saying, all right, I'd like to target your Aboriginal Affairs Minister, I'd like to target your Immigration Minister.
Well, I suppose it would go to a matter of definition, and as was said before, the train driver to Auschwitz, right? So who are the bad guys, and how do we define that, and how are they the people, the public servants who went up to the Northern Territory and imposed that regime?
You would
are
think
they the bad?
Are they
the bad guys?
Should they be
Magnitsky? Depend on your
Magnitsky?
definition and depend on your view, wouldn't it?
What's your view?
Dunno.
Brigid, what's yours?
Look, I think in theory, you know, can't do any harm. I mean,
Can't
you know,
it? I mean, Beijing's fairly irritated right at the moment, aren't they?
Look, no, well, they're already irritated. I mean, it's not about having the law in place. It's how it's applied and where it's used and who it's used against and what the threshold is and how we define these things. But, you know, I think they already exist in, you know, 30-something countries, as we've already heard. And I certainly think it would have an impact, particularly if we were to join a network. And I know that there's, you know, disagreements sometimes about what constitutes, you know, the bad guy here. But there are, you know, a lot of similarities between definitions sometimes when someone's very bad. And so, you know, I actually think it could be useful in certain circumstances. And I think that there's a growing support for it within the Australian Parliament to see it adopted. But further to that, I actually think I hope that it would do a lot to kind of grow awareness among, you know, hopefully the Australian population, but other countries as well, around human rights abuses and where they're occurring and who's responsible, and kind of have a discussion about it at a national level where we're pinpointing things.
Yeah. But, and look, let me just play devil's advocate, Geoffrey. What if Beijing said, look, we actually don't care about the suffering of a few rich people or the few camp commandants in Xinjiang. We're trying to control 1 billion people. So
well, that's what they do say. And they say it in propaganda. And if they say it to us, look at the 470 deaths in custody since the
That's what
Royal
they'll say.
Commission, well, it might make us a little more careful.
You'd hope so.
Yeah, to avoid the allegation of hypocrisy. We might actually obey the Human Rights Committee when it says this or that. I mean, it's an assertion of a country's values, and let us hope that it will make Australian ministers more mindful of the values that they're asserting.
I did hear some very senior public servant, whose name just escapes me at the crucial moment, Rebecca, say peace is a value too. Peace is a value too. And, you know, Geoffrey's pointed out that, you know, a lot of diplomats don't like this because I guess it's the antithesis of diplomacy, isn't it? You're giving it to them with both barrels.
Yeah, but I mean, I think those points about hypocrisy and fundamental values are so important, because if we lose sight of those, we have that creeping towards autocracy and complete ignoring of human rights, and that's what we can't allow to happen. So even if this is a symbol of us taking a stand, then it creates a need for us to articulate our values and then live by them, both in the way that we do things in our own country and the way we expect others to behave as well.
Here's another interesting story today. Deliveroo has lost a major case that could forever change the status of gig economy workers. The tribunal has ruled one of its workers was an employee, not a contractor, with rights to a minimum wage, superannuation and protection from unfair dismissal. Now, the case relates to Diego Franco, who had been driving for the company for 3 years when he was booted off the app for being too slow. The Drum's Stephanie Bolchi spoke to him last year.
I've got an email from Deliveroo saying basically that I would be terminated in 7 days from that email, working with this internal pressure to make money, to go as quickly as you can. It's a very dangerous task.
The Fair Work Commission ruled today that Mr Franco was not carrying on his own independent business, but was instead an employee and was therefore unfairly dismissed.
The dismissal involved an entirely unjust and unreasonable process, including the complete absence of any opportunity for Mr Franco to be heard before the decision to dismiss was made. Deliveroo is not a small business employer, and the size of its enterprise should have enabled it to have adopted far more acceptable and professional employment-related practices and procedures.
Deliveroo has said it will appeal, and it is, quote, confident that riders are independent contractors. Now, this is right in your wheelhouse, Nareen, as an employment specialist. This is a huge judgment, isn't it, about who's an employee and who's not. You've had a scan of the...
I've only skimmed the decision. I haven't read it in detail. It's very long, which leads me to think that the appeal mechanisms are going to be really interesting.
In other words, the Commissioner knew it's going to be appealed and really nailed down his reasons.
Yeah, and I think that that what was important that was raised earlier was that he did order reinstatement and he did order back pay, which further reinforces that Mr Diego, is it Diego? Mr Diego? Anyway, that the applicant is Mr Franco, that he is an employee indeed. And it seems to me from my skimming of the decision that a lot of deliberation has gone into examining the conditions in which he worked and the work he did and how that occurred, which goes to the definition of employee in this country. And he refers to a couple of decisions in the UK as well, a recent one. And so for that reason, I think it is landmark. If it's the case that independent contractors who work for who do this particular type of work on a number of apps, which is the other interesting thing about the decision, that he wasn't just working for Deliveroo, he had to make a living, like so many casuals, people who are classified as casuals, he had to work on a number of different apps to make a living, and that's pretty scary as well.
And what was interesting about the judgment is last April, Uber Eats won one of these cases. Were able to prove that their driver was a contractor on 3 grounds: that she was in control, she decided when and where she worked, that she wasn't exclusive to Uber Eats, and that she didn't wear a uniform. And what's fascinating here is the Commissioner has said Deliveroo had control over the driver. the driver had to book shifts on an app in particular times and zones through a company system. The good drivers could get into that system early and, if you like, bags the good shifts. The not-so-good drivers had to wait 4 hours, the second-tier drivers, and then the third-tier drivers had to wait another few hours before they could get on and essentially roster themselves on like employees do.
Which is a very antiquated way of working. That kind of working is the kind of work that we know about in industrial relations as the bull system that operated on the waterfront.
BULL.
BULL, where people were picked on the basis, by a foreman on the basis of how good they were, and everyone else had to go home. That's the same kind of principle that's being applied here. They'd all line up,
desperate for work.
Desperate for work, and they'd be picked on the basis of who was the best.
Who was the biggest,
who was the biggest,
fastest.
who was the fastest, who was the most capable of picking up big bags of load. And so that really...
And we outlawed that.
We outlawed that a very long time ago. So the notion that this is the way that work's being performed around these apps is of great concern, and I think might be the subject of further deliberation down the track. But I think that the notion of control and what kind of control was implemented by the employer, and that is a consideration as it pertains to the definition of employee, is a really important one.
And that issue of control, Geoffrey, was really interesting in this. The notion there, always with the gig economy, we say, oh, well, the person who signs up, they decide when and where they want to work. And what this judgment says is, you look at the mountain of performance metrics that are gathered on each of these drivers. There is, Geoffrey, the OMDNR. Orders marked delivered, not received. And so this gentleman had 4 OMDNRs. And then there is the RET. And there was a delta between the actual RET and the average RET. And what that means, importantly, is the average RET is how long we think it'll take him to get the pad thai to you. The actual RET is how long it really did take him to get the pad thai to you. And the delta is the time in the middle. And so they've got this system of control.
Absolutely. And
over these drivers.
That's what the case you mentioned, the English case, the Supreme Court decision, which my chambers was involved in, was actually, I think, will make it impossible or unlikely for the appeal to succeed. It was an Uber case, and they decided that Uber really controlled, and therefore they were employed, and that what Uber was trying to get out of was its duties
as an employer.
So, and I think we can see on a broad level, as a result, a good result for a change of the pandemic, there is a greater appreciation of workers, of manual workers, of people who don't have wealthy parents or university degrees, but who are supermarket workers or carers or deliverers, even to the middle classes who can stay at home and work from home. But they have a new dignity because they're called key workers or essential workers and frontline workers. And they deserve, and I think there's a greater recognition of how they deserve a dignity, in this case, the dignity of being represented by a union and having the rights of employees. So even in Britain, the other day, the Conservative government announced a levelling up programme in which they would pay all those who hadn't got a university background to learn a trade, go back to university, whatever. And it's very unusual. Tories levelling up sounds a contradiction in terms. But this is, I think, a reaction to the appreciation given to manual workers who are essential. And I think we're going to find more cases like this reflecting the idea that those who Donald Trump would have called losers in the competition of life, that we want a more just society.
We hope so.
The other thing in the judgment, Brigid, was last year the Commission ruled, look, this Uber Eats driver wasn't exclusive to Uber Eats. Now this Commissioner has said, well, you know what? COVID showed us that if you work from home and you don't have to be at the ABC or at UTS or in the chambers all day, you can actually work for more than one boss and still be an employee. I think that'll be a really interesting decision about how people work in this country if it holds.
But it's absolutely fair. I mean, I don't know many university students that have been able to survive on one casual job a lot of the time. You know, I think at one point I was working 3, just to be able to afford to live out of home and go to university. So that didn't, make me not an employee to, 2 other workplaces. I was an employee of all 3 workplaces. So I think that's absolutely fair. And I think that's why, cases such as these are really important in setting the direction. Sometimes, legislation takes a really long time and it's a bit behind the 8 ball, and there are less innovative sectors that legislation struggles to keep up with, which is why often legislation is quite broad, trying to keep it relevant for as long as possible. And you find, cases like this filling in the gaps, case law filling in the gaps. Now, that's obviously a bit of a balance in situations. You don't want to be outsourcing your role as government to, essentially unelected, legal experts as they are. That's not their job, that's not their burden, but it often is quite a balancing act, I find.
Rebecca, I wonder whether or not, if anyone can sign up to an app, and there was a great long explanation of how Diego da Silva Franco arrived in Australia on Christmas Day 2016, and he started working for Uber in 2017, and he worked for them for 3 years, and exactly how he did it. It was pretty simple. I mean, he just emailed in his information and somebody checked it, and there he was on the app. If this decision holds and everybody's an employee and they're entitled to something more than an email telling them that in 7 days' time 3 years of employment will be terminated with no further discussion, perhaps it changes the gig economy, I wonder, about how you hire people, how discerning you need to be.
Absolutely. And if you think about the business model of those kind of gig economy businesses, they relied on people, in a sense, being prepared to be exploited. But they have to, if they're going to maintain their quality standards and enable people to work safely and to have all the benefits that an employee has, we as consumers are also going to have to accept we might have to pay a bit more for the delivery guy. And going back to Geoffrey's point, do we have a greater appreciation of the value of someone coming and delivering our pad thai on a wet, cold winter night when it's pouring with rain? Well, maybe we should. And maybe this decision can help make that change. Yeah, absolutely.
And at least 5 food delivery drivers died on the job in this country last year.
And we talked about that last time I was here. And it's horrific. But I think what Brigid said was really interesting. We have a community understanding as to what casual work is. Lots and lots of people work more than one casual job. And that point in the decision is really interesting as well, that just because Mr. Diego didn't work only for one employer didn't not make him an employee.
Yeah, I think
really
that'll
interesting.
If the appeal is dismissed, that'll have huge consequences, won't it? Yeah. Who might be an employee?
Yeah.
Who might be entitled? People will have to ask themselves. And then the answer has to be, if you don't know, you can't take the risk of firing them via email with 7 days' notice after 3 years.
Well, there are people who still will. Trust me.
So how many hours did you work today? Perhaps you are still at it. If you are, for goodness sakes, go home. It's not good for you. According to the World Health Organization, hundreds of thousands of us are dying every year from overwork. Researchers linked 745,000 deaths from stroke and heart disease to working long hours in just 2016 alone. Most of the deaths were men, 72%, living in the Western Pacific, which includes Australia. And how long is too long at work? According to the study, working more than 55 hours a week increases your chance of suffering a stroke by 35% and 17% for heart disease. Now, I want to start with you, Bridge, how would you even work out with small children how long you work? I think we came up with a formula just before we came on air, didn't we?
Yeah, when you're passed out of sleep, that's basically when work stops. It's, I don't know what's considered work in my life anymore. I obviously turn up to the office. I come here. Is this work? Probably not. I do it in a personal capacity. I go home. I look after my child. I put him to bed. I won't say I cook. I don't, which is why Uber Eats drivers are very much an essential service for me. But I actually don't know where work begins and starts. And I think for particularly young people who are trying to make their mark in industry, there's a lot of free work that goes on. There's a lot of volunteering, trying to get that experience, trying to shadow seniors, trying to learn more. And, I did that so much through my 20s, free work essentially. And it has paid off. But it's led me to think that I don't really know what's considered work because it's not just the things I get paid for.
Does it get easier when you get on the board, Rebecca?
In some senses, but I guess from a board governance point of view, I think we have to be conscious that the world that we're in values people being present or being seen to be working. And oftentimes organisations that say we value work-life balance actually celebrate the person who never goes home. That's the hero, is the person who's always there. And I certainly saw that in law firms as being something that was seen as valuable. But this research is telling us, and like we knew anyway, that overwork is a work health and safety issue. And going back to the point Brigid makes before about the value of court cases, which I agree with, they can actually sometimes make a real difference. If we had a prosecution in Australia under work health and safety laws for someone having a culture which celebrated people working 90 hours a week, then that would change things dramatically, I think.
Get litigious. When was the last, can you ever remember, they talk about courage and leadership. There's a lot of corporate talk. Do you hear it around the place? Yeah, a lot of corporate talk. And they talk about courage and leadership. When was the last time somebody stood up and said, I think we should do less with less, right? We should do less. We should not flog our people to get them to do more with less. Let's just do less. And not only less quality, just less quantity.
Oh, productivity is a much misunderstood term in this country. And I think... But it's interesting talking about COVID in the context of work. How much has COVID blurred the time between home and work? And what kind of driver is technology? And I just know for what I do, which is log on as soon as I wake up. Well, I check my phone as soon as I get up and check emails. And, there's a lot of things that different groups and stuff that I know about or I'm involved in that are not in Australia, and so I have those and I get emails from bulletins and information, and I'm reading up on that. And then I probably send an email every morning by 8 o'clock in response to someone else, or think, there's someone who I know works really early, and
I'll get it out of them.
Yeah.
How do you work, Geoffrey? When was the last time you worked an 8-hour day consistently?
Never. But I'm a workaholic, so
how many hours do you work a day?
16 a day, probably.
16.
But I think that there is here a real message for Australia, because you know what I've discovered by research in my pocket diary, actually? Of all the countries, all the advanced countries in the world, Australia has the fewest national holidays. I mean, leave aside Christmas, New Year and Easter, we only have 3, basically: Australia Day, Anzac Day and the Queen's birthday, which I can tell you as a Queen's Counsel is not the Queen's real birthday, and it's in June, which is cold. So we need at least 5 more holidays. France, all the European countries have got 9 to 12
Are you being
national
serious?
holidays. I'm absolutely serious.
Just more public holidays?
Even New Zealand
Right.
has got more than we have. 5. So instead
how do we get
of
this?
fighting over Australia Day, let's have Invasion Day and Australia Day.
Not on January the 26th.
Let's have an Independence Day.
Yeah.
I mean, every other country's got an Independence Day. We don't.
And Labor Day.
And Labor Day, and we could commemorate other things. We could commemorate women getting the vote in 1902, first up. We
The
could
Hills
commemorate
hoist, that's big.
John Bradman's first century. We could commemorate November the 11th. We do have a minute to relax in silence, but November the 11th was the day they hanged Ned Kelly and hanged Gough Whitlam out to dry. We remember the dismissal.
You could tick a box, anything you want to remember on November.
On November the 11th. So we need all these. I'd like to see us having Independence Day on December the 8th, because that's the date of Curtin's great speech declaring war on Japan. Australia had never declared war. Britain went to war in 39 and 40, so we were automatically. But for the first time in its life, Australia acted independently on that. It was a great speech.
And that's
it is a great speech.
Darkest hour.
Yeah.
Sweet. We should remember that. There's so much more we could do with our national holidays.
I'm really interested to just figure out from you all, why is Australia like this? I mean, we see ourselves as sort of larrikins and going to the beach and all the rest of it. And
Well,
we're not
I
a bit
don't.
of it.
We're not.
We're not a bit of it.
Absolutely not.
We're right up there with the Japanese. What's happened?
Well, that's a very long conversation, Ellen, about the nature of the alleged Australian character. But I think we work really hard, and I think that productivity is a much misunderstood term in this country.
That just being there all the time is not part of it.
It doesn't mean just working your guts out for nothing. It means working smart as well.
But can I just
and
ask...
that's what we have to incentivise.
Yeah.
But have you ever had a manager? Have you ever had a manager come to you in the board and say, "I've got a presentation for you. I'm really hoping to get my bonus later in the year, and I'm going to do less with the money you give me so I don't flog." And they say, "Terrific! Give that person a bonus. That's fantastic." No. That's never going to happen, is it?
No,
but that's what has to happen, Rebecca, doesn't it? If you want to work less.
Yep. Absolutely. So that needs leadership for sure, and it needs brave leadership.
Well, I think it needs a
discussion
for starters. I think this is a very good starting point. I think it should begin a national conversation. Yeah, absolutely. Why do we celebrate the Queen's birthday? Like, it's not even her birthday. And
well,
why
we're
do
trying
we
to get
celebrate
9, so let's just keep the ones we have. Okay. Brigid, just a final one. What about you young folk? Are you a bit more willing to work long hours, crazier hours than you perhaps should for a sense of mission and purpose? Just quickly.
I was always in a hurry in my 20s, so I worked much longer hours, particularly in Parliament. It was, in at 7, out after 10 when the Senate rose. That was my first experience of, full-time work, essentially.
Wow.
And so I didn't know any different. I literally thought,
that was
normal.
My
gosh, I'm going to have to work like this for the rest of my life. Now, that is not normal. Anyone watching, not normal. I gained a lot of experience. It was fantastic. But,
thank God you
not
don't do
sustainable.
And
not sustainable.
And then you had kids and you're right back where you started. Thanks so much for coming in. I hope there's dinner when you get home. Brigid, a wonderful panel tonight. Thanks so much for joining us. Good night to you.